Laura stood at the speaking platform in the Great Council chamber and felt the weight of 73 years pressing down on her shoulders. The chamber was vast and filled with representatives from over 200 species. Some had scales and some had feathers and some had bodies that human eyes could barely understand. But all of them were watching her with the same expression she had seen 1,000 times before. It was the look they always gave humans, a mixture of suspicion and barely hidden contempt. The representative Al had just finished speaking. His accusations were the same as always. Human traders had violated sacred trade routes. Human ships had entered restricted space. Human colonists had shown disrespect to customs. None of it was true. Laura had the evidence on her data tablet showing that the human traders had followed every regulation perfectly. But evidence had never mattered when it came to accusations against humanity. She remembered her first day on this station 12 years ago. She had been so hopeful then. She had believed that patience and diplomacy would eventually win the respect of the other species. Her predecessor had believed the same thing, and his predecessor before him. For 73 years, humanity had been members of this council, and for 73 years they had endured accusations and insults and restrictions that no other species faced. Laura looked at the High Arbiter who sat on the elevated platform at the center of the chamber. He was old even by the standards of his long-lived species, and he had led this council for over a century. He had seen humanity arrive as eager newcomers hopping to join the galactic community. He had watched as they and their allies worked to keep humanity contained and isolated, and he had done nothing to stop it. She began her response in the calm, measured tone that had become her trademark. She acknowledged the concerns of the collective. She offered to submit to mediation for the 14th time this year alone. She presented her evidence showing that the accusations were baseless, and she watched as the council members ignored everything she said just as they always did. Commander Price stood at the back of the chamber in his formal military uniform. He was her military and her closest friend on the station. After the session ended, he walked with her through the corridors toward the human embassy. "I do not understand how you do it," he said quietly. "Every time they lie about us, you just stand there and take it. We have the ships to make them respect us. We have the technology. Earth could challenge the tomorrow if we wanted to." Laura stopped walking and turned to face him. "That is exactly what they want," she said. "They want us to strike first so they can tell the whole galaxy that humans are violent and dangerous. They have been trying to provoke us for 73 years. Our patience is the only thing keeping us alive." Shook his head but said nothing more. He had heard this argument before. Every human who served on the council had heard it. Patience was humanity's greatest weapon. Diplomacy was the path to acceptance. These were the words that every ambassador had spoken since humanity first joined the galactic community. But Laura was beginning to wonder if those words were still true. They reached the embassy and Laura sat down at her desk to review the day's messages. Most of them were routine: trade requests and diplomatic inquiries, and the usual complaints from Earth about the slow progress of their colonization applications. They had blocked 14 of them in the past decade. Worlds that humanity desperately needed were sitting empty because one species had decided that humans should not be allowed to grow. Then she saw the encrypted message from Earth Command, and her blood went cold. The colony world knew had gone silent. 3 days ago, all communication had stopped. The last transmission mentioned ships entering the system. 340,000 people lived on Nu, including families and children and elderly settlers who had spent their life savings to build new homes on a distant world. Laura immediately called for an emergency session of the council. She presented the evidence of ships in the new system. She demanded an investigation into the communication blackout. She pleaded for the council to send observers to determine what had happened. Al rose to speak against her. He called the evidence circumstantial. He suggested that the communication failure was due to human incompetence. He reminded the council that ships had every right to travel through space near human colonies, and when the vote was called, the council sided with him as they always did. "Insufficient evidence," said the High Arbiter. "The motion is." Laura stood frozen at the speaking platform. 340,000 of her people might be dying at this very moment. Children might be crying for parents who would never come. Families might be huddling in shelters while weapons rained down on their homes. And the council had decided that it was not worth investigating. She looked around the chamber at the representatives who had just voted against her. Some of them avoided her eyes. Some of them looked bored. And some of them smiled with the same satisfied expression that Al wore on his alien face. For 73 years, humanity had chosen patience. They had endured every insult and every accusation and every injustice because they believed that someday the galaxy would see them as equals. They had held back their anger and their pride and their strength because they wanted to be good neighbors in a community that had never wanted them. Laura walked out of the chamber without another word, fell into step beside her, and she could see the question in his eyes. She did not have an answer for him yet, but something had changed inside her. Something that had been building for 73 years had finally reached its limit. When she reached the embassy, she sent a message to Admiral Cole. The Third Fleet was 3 days away from Nu. Laura told her to begin moving toward the colony at maximum speed. She did not have the authority to order military action, but she had the authority to position forces for a response. And for the first time in her career, Laura was not sure that patience was the right choice anymore. The transmission came through in broken fragments filled with static and interference. Laura stood in the embassy communications center with at her side watching the flickering image on the screen. Governor appeared for a moment and then disappeared behind waves of distortion. His face was covered in dust and blood, and behind him Laura could see flames and falling debris. They came without warning. His voice crackled through the speakers. "Warships. They started bombing the capital 3 hours ago. We have people trapped in the shelters, but they are targeting civilian areas. They are targeting schools and hospitals and residential blocks. This is not a military action. This is extermination." The image flickered again, and Laura saw movement behind the governor. People were running and screaming. A child was crying somewhere off-screen. The sound of explosions came through the audio feed like distant thunder. "Please," he said, and his voice broke with desperation. "We have 340,000 people here. Families, children, please send help. Please tell the council what is happening. They have to listen. They have to." The transmission cut out and the screen went dark. Laura stood motionless for a long moment. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against the console to hide it. 340,000 people. Families and children and elderly settlers who had done nothing wrong. They were dying right now while the council debated whether the evidence was sufficient. She turned to and saw that his face had gone pale with fury. "What do we do?" he asked. "The Third Fleet is still 2 days away, even at maximum speed. By the time they arrive, there might not be anyone left to save." Laura closed her eyes and made her decision. "Call an emergency session," she said. "Full council assembly. I am going to give them one more chance." The council chamber was already full when she arrived. Word had spread quickly about the transmission from Nu. Some of the representatives looked concerned. Others looked curious, and they sat in their section with expressions of complete calm as if nothing unusual was happening. Laura walked to the speaking platform and began without waiting for permission. She broadcast the transmission from Governor on every screen in the chamber. She let them see the fire and the destruction. She let them hear the screaming. She let them watch as a human colony was destroyed by weapons. When the recording ended, she spoke in a voice that was steady and cold. "You have seen the evidence. Warships are bombarding a human civilian colony. 340,000 people are dying while we stand here and debate. I am asking this council to authorize immediate intervention." Al rose to respond. He spoke with the same arrogant tone he always used when addressing human concerns. "This is an internal matter," he said. "The colony of Nu exists within a disputed territory. The collective has every right to enforce our territorial claims. This council has no authority to interfere." Laura stared at him with disbelief. "Children are dying," she said. "Your ships are bombing schools and hospitals. How can you call this a territorial dispute?" Al spread his forearms in a gesture that might have been a shrug. "Humans should not have settled in disputed space. The consequences of that decision are not our responsibility." Laura turned to the High Arbiter. She looked at the representatives of species who had called themselves neutral. She searched for any sign that someone would stand with humanity against this massacre. The vote was called. One by one, the species abstained or voted against intervention. Some cited procedural concerns. Some claimed they needed more information. Some simply followed as they had always done. When the count was finished, humanity stood alone. Laura felt something break inside her. It was not her spirit and it was not her hope. It was something older and deeper. It was the chain that had held back 73 years of grievances and insults and injustices. It was the belief that patience would eventually be rewarded. It was gone now, burned away by the images of burning homes and dying children. She turned to face the full council and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. "For 73 years, humanity has been a member of this council. We came to you as friends seeking partnership and cooperation. We stayed even when you rejected our colonization requests. We stayed even when you imposed unfair trade restrictions. We stayed even when you accused us of crimes we did not commit. We stayed because we believed in the ideals of this council." She paused and looked directly at Al. "Today I have learned that those ideals are lies. This council does not seek justice. It does not protect the innocent. It exists to serve the interests of those with power and to silence those without it." The chamber had gone completely quiet. Representatives who had been whispering among themselves stopped to listen. Even the High Arbiter leaned forward with an expression of concern. "Therefore," said Laura, "I am formally withdrawing Earth's recognition of Council authority over human territories. From this moment forward, humanity will defend its own people by whatever means necessary. We will no longer ask permission to protect our families. We will no longer beg for justice that will never come." She stepped down from the platform and walked toward the exit, followed her with a look of shock on his face. Behind them, the chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives were shouting and demanding clarification and calling for emergency votes. Laura stopped at the door and turned back one final time. "We came to you as friends," she said. "We stayed as partners. We endured as petitioners. Today we leave as something you have never seen. Today you will learn what happens when humanity stops asking and starts demanding." She walked out of the chamber and the doors closed behind her. The message to Admiral Cole was already prepared. The Third Fleet had authorization to engage. Whatever came next, humanity would face it together. And the galaxy would finally learn why they should have treated humans with respect. Admiral Cole stood on the bridge of the carrier Resolute and watched the stars streak past on the main display. The Third Fleet was moving at speeds that would have seemed impossible to the galaxy's other species. For 73 years, humanity had hidden the true capabilities of their ships and weapons. They had deliberately underperformed in joint exercises and kept their best technology secret. The Council had never seen what human engineering could really do. Now they were about to find out. The fleet consisted of 47 warships ranging from destroyers to battle cruisers. Every crew member had volunteered for this mission after hearing about Nu. Some of them had family on that colony. Others simply could not stand by while innocent people were slaughtered. They had trained for years hoping they would never have to fight, but they were ready. Captain Samuel Grant commanded the destroyer Dawn's Edge at the front of the formation. His ship was the fastest in the fleet and would be the first to reach Nu. He had been monitoring communications since they left Earth space, and what he heard made his blood boil. They were not just attacking New. They were planning to hit 3 more human colonies in the coming weeks. This was not a territorial dispute. It was a coordinated campaign to destroy human expansion before humanity became too powerful to stop. Admiral Cole received his report and felt a cold anger settle in her chest. For decades, she had followed orders and held back, and trusted that diplomacy would protect her people. She had watched human colonies struggle under unfair restrictions, while settlements flourished with council support. She had attended funerals for sailors killed in accidents that later turned out to be sabotage. No more. The Third Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the new system. The sight that greeted them was devastating. The capital city was burning. Smoke clouds covered half the continent. Warships hung in orbit like predators circling wounded prey. But there were also signals coming from underground shelters. Survivors. Tens of thousands of people had made it to the emergency bunkers beneath the cities. They were alive and waiting for rescue. Admiral Cole opened a channel to the fleet. "This is Admiral Cole of the Earth Defense Force. You are engaged in an illegal attack on a civilian population. You have 5 minutes to withdraw your forces and surrender your commanding officers to human custody. If you refuse, we will remove you by force." The commander responded with laughter. He told her that humans had no authority in this sector. He reminded her that the council had declined to intervene. He suggested that she turn her little fleet around before she started a war that humanity could not win. Admiral Cole ended the transmission and gave the order to attack. What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. The human fleet moved with precision and speed that they had never seen. Weapons that Earth had kept hidden for decades tore through shields like paper. Targeting systems that could track a single escape pod in the chaos of battle ensured that every shot found its mark. Captain Samuel Grant led the first wave in the Dawn's Edge. His ship destroyed 3 cruisers in the opening minutes. The enemy tried to form defensive formations, but human tactics were designed to exploit exactly those patterns. Every time the humans adapted and struck from unexpected angles. In 47 minutes it was over. The entire assault fleet was destroyed or disabled. Not a single human ship was lost. The survivors in the shelters below were safe. Across the galaxy, other species watched in stunned silence. Intelligence agencies reviewed the battle footage again and again, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Humanity had always seemed like a minor power in the galactic order. Their ships were adequate but unimpressive. Their weapons were functional but not exceptional. They had never shown any sign of military superiority. It had all been a deception. Laura broadcast a message from the council station to every corner of known space. She explained what had happened at New. She showed footage of the attack on civilian targets. She revealed intercepted communications proving that 3 more colonies had been scheduled for destruction. And then she made a promise. "Humanity seeks no empire," she said. "We want no conquest and no revenge. We want only to live in peace and to protect our people. But we will no longer tolerate attacks on innocent civilians. We will no longer accept discrimination and injustice from a council that was supposed to represent all species equally. From this day forward, any attack on human territory will be met with overwhelming force." The response came quickly. They demanded that the council condemn humanity and authorize sanctions. They called for a military coalition to contain the human threat. They expected their allies to fall in line as they always had. But something had changed. Species who had remained silent for decades began speaking out. The representatives stood before the council and condemned the attack. From their trade agreement with the collective, smaller species who had been afraid to oppose the suddenly found their courage. Price received intelligence reports showing the shift in galactic opinion. The footage of burning schools and hospitals had done what 73 years of human diplomacy could not. It had shown the galaxy who the real aggressors were. Laura watched the reports come in and felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. Not because humanity had won a battle, but because for the first time other species were willing to stand with them. The war was not over. The Still had a powerful military and they would not surrender easily. But humanity was no longer alone, and the galaxy would never look at them the same way again. The human fleet gathered at the edge of space 3 weeks after the Battle of Nu. Admiral Cole now commanded over 200 warships from every corner of human territory. It was the largest military force humanity had ever assembled, and it sat motionless in the void like a storm waiting to break. Laura arrived on the flagship Resolute to oversee what came next. She had spent the past weeks in constant communication with Earth Command and with species across the galaxy who were watching to see what humanity would do. Some expected conquest, others expected revenge, most expected blood. They were going to be disappointed. Price met her in the intelligence center with a data tablet full of information that would change everything. His team had been working around the clock to analyze captured records and intercepted communications. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The attack on Nu was not an isolated incident, Laura, he said. It was part of a campaign that has been going on since the day humanity joined the Council. 73 years of sabotage and assassination and economic warfare. All of it hidden behind diplomatic lies and fabricated accusations. Laura took the tablet and began reading. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the evidence. 12 years ago, there had been a plague on the colony world Meridian that killed 6,000 people. Medical experts had called it a natural outbreak. They had engineered it. 20 years ago, Ambassador William had died in a shuttle accident that was blamed on human mechanical failure. They had planted a bomb. 30 years ago, the Council had imposed trade restrictions on human exports citing safety concerns. They had bribed officials to create those concerns from nothing. The list went on and on. 73 years of humanity struggling against obstacles that had been deliberately placed in their path. 73 years of diplomacy that had been doomed from the start because one species had decided that humans must never be allowed to succeed. Laura looked up from the tablet with tears in her eyes. They never gave us a chance, she said quietly. From the very beginning, they were trying to destroy us. Nodded, and they almost succeeded. If they had managed to wipe out those 4 colonies, they would have crippled our expansion for generations. By the time we recovered, they would have turned the entire Council against us permanently. Laura wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. She had a decision to make. The fleet outside could devastate space. They could burn cities and shatter infrastructure and make the pay for every life they had taken. Part of her wanted exactly that. But that was not who humanity was supposed to be. She called an emergency session of the Council and broadcast the evidence to every species in the galaxy. She showed them the engineered plagues and the assassinations and the economic sabotage. She let them see the full scope of crimes against humanity. And then something unexpected happened. Counselor of the Rose to speak. Her species was ancient and respected, and they had remained neutral in most galactic conflicts. But now her voice shook with emotion as she addressed the assembly. They did the same thing to my people, she said. 3 centuries ago they destroyed our colony ships and blamed it on spatial anomalies. They poisoned our trade goods and accused us of incompetence. We spent 200 years rebuilding what they took from us, and we never knew who was responsible. Until today. Other species began coming forward. They had lost a generation of leaders to unexplained accidents. They had seen promising technologies stolen and patents filed by corporations. They had been driven from their ancestral territory by conflicts that they had secretly orchestrated. For centuries, the collective had maintained their power by undermining everyone around them. They had hidden their crimes behind diplomacy and manipulation, and now the truth was finally coming out. Prime leader of the collective requested a private meeting with Laura. She agreed to see him on neutral ground with Admiral Cole and Price at her side. Was tall and imposing with the 4 arms and armored skin of his species. He had ruled the collective for 50 years, and he had never faced a challenge like this one. His arrogance was gone, now replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "We can negotiate," he said. "Territory, trade rights, reparations. Name your price and humanity will have it. Just call off your fleet and stop spreading these accusations." Laura looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the people who had died because of schemes. She thought about Governor and the children of Nu. She thought about 73 years of patience and hope that had been betrayed. "You do not negotiate with us," she said. "You answer to every species you have wronged. This is not about what humanity wants. This is about justice for everyone you have hurt." Tried to argue, but Laura was already walking away. Behind her, Price was coordinating with representatives from a dozen species. A coalition was forming that had nothing to do with conquest or revenge. It was about holding the accountable for crimes that span centuries. The military made one last desperate attempt to break the coalition. They launched a surprise attack on the human fleet, hoping to destroy enough ships to force a retreat. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Admiral Cole had been expecting something like this. Her ships were ready and waiting. The assault force was destroyed in less than an hour with minimal human casualties. After the battle, sent another message asking for terms. This time he was not negotiating, he was begging. Laura read his message and felt no satisfaction. There was no joy in watching an empire crumble. There was only the grim determination to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. She began drafting the terms of surrender. 6 months had passed since the day humanity's patience broke, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. Laura stood at the speaking platform in the council chamber once again, but everything around her was different. The chamber itself had been redesigned to remove the elevated sections that had once separated powerful species from weaker ones. Now all representatives sat at the same level as equals. The High Arbiter had retired shortly after the war. He had admitted in his final speech that he had failed in his duty to ensure justice for all species. He had known about manipulation for decades and had done nothing because he feared the consequences. His confession had shocked the council, but it had also opened the door for real change. Price now served as humanity's first security counselor. His role was to ensure that the intelligence failures of the past could never happen again. He had built a network of analysts and investigators drawn from dozens of species, all working together to monitor for threats and expose corruption before it could take root. Admiral Cole had overseen the dismantling of offensive military capabilities. The process had been careful and methodical. The goal was not to leave the defenseless, but to ensure they could never again threaten their neighbors. Some of their ships had been converted to humanitarian vessels. Others had been recycled to build stations that would serve as neutral meeting grounds for species that had once been enemies. The collective itself had fractured. Species that had been forcibly absorbed into their empire for centuries had declared independence. Trade partners who had been coerced into unfair agreements had renegotiated on equal terms. What had once been the most powerful force in the galaxy was now a shadow of its former self. But Laura took no pleasure in their downfall. She had never wanted conquest or revenge. She had wanted justice and safety for her people, and a galaxy where no species could dominate others through fear and manipulation. Governor stood on the surface of Nu watching construction crews rebuild the capital. Aid had come from a dozen species who now called humanity their ally. They had sent engineers to help design stronger shelters. They had provided food and medical supplies. Even species who had voted against intervention 6 months ago had contributed to the recovery effort. The scars would take years to heal. Thousands had died in the initial attack, and thousands more had been wounded. The survivors carried trauma that would last a lifetime, but they also carried hope. They knew that they would never be abandoned again. Laura addressed the newly reformed council with a speech that had taken her weeks to prepare. She spoke of humanity's original vision when they first reached out to the stars. They had dreamed of a galaxy united by cooperation and mutual respect. They had imagined a community where every species could grow and thrive without fear of those more powerful. We did not break our patience to become what the were, she said. We broke it so that no one would ever have to endure what they did to us. Humanity does not seek to rule this council. We seek to serve it. We seek to build something better than what came before. She paused and looked around the chamber at representatives who had once dismissed her concerns without a second thought. Some of them could not meet her eyes. Others nodded with respect they had never shown before. They believed that power comes from domination, she continued. They believed that the only way to be safe was to make everyone else afraid. They were wrong. True strength comes from trust and cooperation, and the willingness to stand together against those who would harm the innocent. After the session ended, Laura walked through the corridors of the station toward the human embassy. She passed representatives from species she had never spoken to before. Many of them stopped to thank her or to express support for the new direction of the council. A few even apologized for the way they had treated humanity in the past. She reached the embassy and found waiting with news. The N and 6 other species had formally requested alliance treaties with Earth. They wanted to build permanent partnerships based on trade and cultural exchange and mutual defense. Laura smiled for the first time in months. This was what humanity had always wanted, not conquest but friendship, not domination but respect. That evening she attended a diplomatic reception hosted by one of the neutral species. The gathering included representatives from across the galaxy, and Laura spent hours in conversations that would have been impossible 6 months ago. Species that had ignored humanity for decades were now eager to learn about human culture and history. Near the end of the evening, a young approached her. The young female was barely an adult by her species standards, and she wore the simple clothing of a student rather than the elaborate robes of a diplomat. Her name was, and she had traveled across the galaxy specifically to speak with Laura. I wanted to apologize, she said. Her voice was quiet and her forearms were folded in a gesture of submission. What my people did to yours was unforgivable. I know that words cannot undo the past, but I wanted you to know that not all supported our leaders. Some of us always believed it was wrong. Laura looked at the young alien and saw something she had not expected. She saw shame and guilt and a desperate hope for redemption. She saw someone who had been born into a society that taught her to hate but who had chosen a different path. She reached out and took one of his hands in her own. The future is not written yet, she said. Your people made terrible choices, but that does not mean you are bound by them. If you want to build something better, then humanity will help you. We did not fight this war to create new enemies. We fought it to end a cycle of fear and hatred. Looked at her with surprise and gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. I did not expect kindness. Laura smiled. Neither did the council. That is why they underestimated us. She returned to the embassy late that night and stood at the window looking out at the stars. Somewhere out, their new was being rebuilt. Somewhere out, their human colonies were expanding without fear of sabotage or attack. Somewhere out, their species that had suffered under oppression for centuries were finally free. No species in the council remembered the exact day humanity's patience broke. The records would show the date and the circumstances, but the true meaning of that moment would fade into legend. What they remembered instead was what came after. They remembered a galaxy transformed by the determination of a species that had been pushed too far. They remembered a community rebuilt on the ashes of tyranny. And they remembered the most important lesson of all. Humanity's true strength was never their ships or their weapons. It was their stubborn refusal to become the monsters they had fought against. It was the hope they carried even in their darkest hour. It was their belief that the galaxy could be better and their willingness to fight for that belief. Laura turned away from the window and began preparing for tomorrow. There was still so much work to do.